Good morning. Really warm welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. This is a really exciting day for us, and I hope for you too. We've got a lot to tell you about today. So this is to launch our latest report on the UK's sixth carbon budget. Also our analysis of the path to net zero for the UK, which is, I think, the more exciting thing that we can tell you about this morning. Now, thanks to the miracle of science, I'm joining you today from Glasgow, and you're going to hear voices from around the UK today. This is an unusual year, a year of turmoil, of course, and it's forced us into launching this report in a different way. And I think I'm very happy to say, actually, this is a better way for us to communicate with you. This is something I hope we'll be doing more of in the future. So coming up today, we've got a lot to get through today. You're going to hear in a second from our chairman, Lord Deben, who's going to give us some introductory remarks. Then we're going to have a short piece for you with my colleague Mike Thompson and I taking you through the key findings of our report, which we recorded just a little earlier. And then we've got Polita Clark helping us out with the Q&A this morning, and you'll be able to participate if you're part of our webinar this morning by asking some questions as we go along. Should be great. It should take us through to 11:30 this morning, and let's get going, and let's begin immediately by going across to our chairman and to Lord Deben. So, John, over to you.
Today we can announce the sixth carbon budget. It's a wholly different budget from any that we have done before, because instead of it being just a budget, it's actually the pathway that we have to tread in order to reach net zero in 2050. Of course, Parliament has already said that that is our statutory requirement. Britain has to do that. But how does it do it? And that's what the sixth carbon budget shows. It shows step by step how we get there, how we actually make our contribution to the world battle to set back climate change. Now, the Prime Minister has already accepted the key part of that in saying that by 2030, we're going to have to reduce our emissions by 68%. Now, that is a remarkable promise, but it is crucial. We have to do that if we're going to reach net zero by 2050. And we now have a route map, so government will be able to legislate, to regulate, and above all to encourage, so that we can do the job properly. I say encourage because most of the cost is going to be carried by the private sector. That's where the investment comes. And the great and remarkable fact is that that investment is precisely the kind of investment that we have to do in any way in order to get out of the post-COVID problems. We want to grow our economy again. If we want to put Britain back on the map again, then these are precisely the investments that we have to make. So in fighting climate change, we are improving the economy, and we are making ourselves able to compete. Because now we live in a world in which others have made the same choice. We were very much ahead of the pack, but now China, South Korea, Japan, and under President-elect Joe Biden, the United States, are all going to be committed to net zero. So if we want to export to them, if we want to build our economy together with them, we'll have to produce low and no carbon products. So it's in our whole economic interest to make the jobs, to ensure the future, and to make the economic success that we need to fight climate change, as this sixth carbon budget explains. But we won't win. We can't win if we don't do this in a just and fair way. The people will join and do the things that we all need to do together if they feel that we are in it together. If they feel that the burdens are being borne by the few and not by the many, by those who can't afford it rather than those who can afford it, then frankly, we're not going to win this battle. So we need a just transition. And that is what the Climate Change Committee, in producing the sixth carbon budget, has been planning. So here we are with real opportunity. Yes, it's ambition, but it's an ambition which is driven by the facts of climate change. They are not in our hands at the moment, and we want to regain control. And to do that, we need to fulfill this budget, and to do it step by step, but start immediately. The longer we put it off, the more expensive and the more difficult. And that's why we look to the government to start on that route, as it's already promised to do in the Prime Minister's 10 points. It now needs to put the money, the enthusiasm, the regulation and the legislation behind that. And it needs to create the situation in which the private sector will do the investment which we need.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John. Now, we have published an awful lot of material this morning, and many of you might have been on the website looking at it already. So we've got over 1,000 pages in total of material that we have published, brought together, really culminating today with a huge amount of work that we've been working on over the last few years. Because it's so much stuff, we thought it would be a good idea to try and bring together for you some of the headlines. So my colleague Mike Thompson, who's our Director of Analysis, and I have donned our CCC issue blue jumpers, and we've recorded a presentation that takes you through the key findings. So we're going to turn to that now. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Really excited to take you through the findings of our latest report. I'll be going to be joined in a second by my colleague Mike Thompson, who's our Director of Analysis and Chief Economist. Really excited to take you through the findings today. So let's get started, but let's begin with just a bit of background. This is the product of 2 years of work for the CCC, building, of course, on the big report we published last year on net zero. It's a major piece of work for us. I want to just start with a bit of background, though, about the thing that has inspired this piece of work, and that's the Climate Change Act. So the Climate Change Act is the UK's climate law. It has a long-term goal of net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. It also has these interim targets which take us on the glide path to that long-term goal. They're called the carbon budgets. So one of the things we'll be looking at today is the sixth carbon budget, which we have to advise on. That's for the period 2033 to 37. And we will be looking at that sixth carbon budget period and offering our advice on what the target should be for that period. But what we're going to do today is a bit more than just looking at the sixth carbon budget. We're actually going to take you on the path all the way to net zero for the UK. And that's what's so exciting about this work. It's a genuine route map to the full decarbonisation of the UK, a proper blueprint for how the UK could do this. Now, we're going to make this recommendation to government, and it's for government then to think about whether it can legislate that target for the sixth carbon budget. Let's get started, and let's just start with a bit of context here. Last year, in our report on net zero, what we were trying to do was describe how the UK looked in 2050. So when we've got to the goal of net zero, what we're doing today is much more interesting. We're looking at the journey to that long-term goal and all of the changes that we'll see along the way. And to do that, what we've been trying to do is to build multiple paths to the goal of net zero, so multiple scenarios. We built 3 illustrative scenarios that get us all the way to that long-term goal, and you can see them here. So the first of these is the engagement scenario, or widespread engagement. This is a scenario where where businesses are more responsive to the need to decarbonize. They're more willing to make the change to low-carbon alternatives, more willing to move from high-carbon goods and activities. Innovation, our widespread innovation scenario, really interesting scenario. This is a world where we see more adoption of low carbon technologies. We see those kind of cost reductions that go with that. It's a world when we've got a cheap power price. We're producing cheap, clean electricity, and that flows through the economy in different ways. We use different technologies, including technologies that actually take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and suck it out and store it under the sea. And lastly, we have the Headwind Scenario. Now, Headwinds is quite similar to what we said last year in our net zero report. Progress is heavier going in headwinds, so we need to make more provision with big infrastructure. This is a world where you're going to see more hydrogen being produced, more use of carbon capture and storage. And we can also build something really exciting that we were really keen to explore in the CCC, which is a fourth scenario. We call this our Tailwind Scenario. This is a scenario that explores a really optimistic take on what could happen over the coming years. We're exploring the upper bounds of really what is feasible here when it comes to cost reduction, when it comes to investment, also behaviour change. This is the world that shows you what would be necessary for the UK to get to net zero early. So Tailwinds gets to net zero in the early 2040s. We can't just take it off the shelf, sadly, because you have to believe that all of that will come together. So it's an optimistic take on what could happen in the UK. And the last of the scenarios, and this is the one that we're going to be talking about most today, is what we call the balanced pathway. And this is our attempt to look at all of the bottom-up changes that need to happen in each sector across the economy. And we've taken a decision on what we regard as a kind of balanced set of outcomes here. Crucially, what the balanced pathway is trying to do is to progress as much as we can through the 2020s and then keep open the options from those exploratory scenarios through the 2030s and the 2040s. It's really ambitious, as you'd expect from us. It's challenging, and big message for the government about getting on track for this stuff. But crucially, it's also feasible, and I think it's really appealing as well. So we use this pathway to make our recommendations, including the recommendation on the UK's 2030 target, which the UK will be submitting to the UN process, and also the sixth carbon budget itself. So let's get started and let's talk about what we are actually recommending. And this is going to be the first of the really important charts that we show you today. And this is the one that really we need to kind of land with you, the big messages here in this chart. So first thing to say about this chart is look at the shape of it. You can see the sixth carbon budget period there in orange. You can see our historical emissions before it. It's a kind of S-shaped, a kind of inverted S-shape, and that tells a story which we'll be explaining in a second. The headline message here is that by 2035, our recommendation is that the UK has to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 78% from where they stood in 1990. That is a really ambitious goal. Now, just remember, until last year, the target we had for 2050 was an 80% reduction. So we've effectively brought that forward by 15 years. That's the measure of how ambitious we're now being by having that net zero goal set in law. That requires a faster pace of emissions reduction over the next 30 years than we achieved in the last 30 years. And it's also a path that's front-loaded. If you were to divide up the emissions reduction over the next 30 years into two 15-year chunks, what you'd see is it's a kind of 60-40 split. We're doing 60% of the emissions reduction in the first 15 years and 40 in the next. That's really important. It's important for a few reasons. The first is that requires investment early, and that investment we think can support the UK's economic recovery from the pandemic. Secondly, what we're doing is opening up the options by front-loading it in that way. So opening up the new industries that we'll create, the new jobs that go with that, the options for reducing cost as well will be opened up by going early. We can also go further on emissions later if we open up the opportunities now. And the last thing, of course, that's really important by going front-loaded on this is that we are minimizing the UK's contribution to climate change itself, our cumulative emissions. That's important, of course, for the Paris goals, which are global. So let's talk about the global impact next. So what we're looking at here is a different chart. This is our global emissions per person. What you can see here is the global goal per person, a historical chart which shows you actually we've been flatlining historically over the last few years when it comes to emissions per person. And then the challenge of the Paris Agreement, which you can see here, the falling red line is the challenge to keep warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And the green line is the challenge of meeting the most ambitious part of the climate agreement set in Paris of meeting a 1.5 degree threshold, temperature threshold. If we just overlay on top of that the UK path, it tells a really interesting story. You can see that historically, over the last 30 years, we've been cutting our per person emissions quite well, to the point where we're almost at the global average today. And by 2035, the UK is actually hitting that 1.5 degree pathway. So it's really ambitious, this pathway that we're recommending, and we're confident, therefore, that this is a pathway that's aligned well with the Paris requirements for carbon budgets. Okay, let's talk about now how we can deliver all this, and we're going to get into now the really exciting stuff, I think. And we wanted to give you some fresh insights about the challenge of how the UK can cut its emissions, abate carbon. So I'm going to turn now to my colleague Mike, and Mike, perhaps you can tell us a bit about what we've learned along the way.
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. This is our rainbow of abatement, and every stripe here is a different way of reducing the UK's emissions. And we think it's useful to categorise these into 4 broad types. Every stripe here is a different way of reducing the UK's emissions. And you can group them into 3 broad types in here. You've got the purpley ones up at the top. These are about demand. Slight reductions in high carbon activities with more low carbon activities instead. And so we've got there things like driving less, cycling more, flying less, more video conferencing, less eating of meat and more plant-based foods. There's also efficiency in that. So things like insulating your home, making it more comfortable, but needing less energy to heat it. And if you look in the nearer term here, 2025, 2030, these are really important in the short term. And that matters because they're not strongly targeted by current government policy. And so they can really help us to deliver the UK's NDC for 2030. And of course, they make the rest of the rainbow easier to deliver. Going down then, we've got the orange, the red, the yellow. This is where the real action is in the long term. Adopting low carbon technologies, electric cars and heat pumps for households, carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen in industry. The biggest wedge here is electrification. That's the most efficient and generally the cheapest thing that we can do. So as in other studies, it comes out as the biggest and the brightest stripe in our rainbow. Of course, we need low carbon fuels as well to run those technologies. So the blue wedge here is a big expansion of low carbon electricity, primarily from offshore wind, supplemented by some low carbon hydrogen. Finally, then, the green wedge reminds us this isn't just an energy story. There's a vital role for our land as well. There are some sources of emissions that we can't avoid, like those from cows and sheep and probably planes. And so we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere to offset those. The net in net zero. Now, we don't assume much contribution from CO2 sucking machines. So this means lots and lots of trees. Some energy crops as well alongside those that we can cycle and use with carbon capture and storage to bury the CO2 under the sea. Put all of those together, we get down to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, net zero 2050. Back to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. So let's take another take on the challenge of net zero. And this is looking now at the challenge of behavior change, societal change, and also technology. This was a chart that we produced last year for net zero. I was quite surprised how popular it was, actually. So we wanted to rerun the numbers. This is looking at the challenge of how we abate carbon to 2035 and looking at how we divide that up across behavior change and technological change. So about 2/5 of the emissions reduction that we are recommending comes from pure technology change. So that could be a simple thing like switching of fuel. It could also be about closing a power plant. That tends to be the kind of change that people don't notice directly. The rest of it involves some element of changed behavior. So we've got the kind of pure behavior change, which you can see in the orange wedge here. That's the change in diets that we might see over the coming years. It could be about flying less, just as Mike says. The rest of it, which is the pink wedge, that's the really interesting stuff for me. That's where we're bringing together technology and behavior change to cut emissions. There is nothing, of course, to be afraid of here at all. This is the kind of changes that we'll see in our day-to-day life. So we might be plugging in our car, for example, rather than taking it to a petrol station. You might be heating your home from a heat pump rather than using a gas boiler. These are the changes that we will see in our lives, but of course they won't be a major change to our lifestyles. And the crucial thing here is we're going to have a discussion about these kind of changes. We've been drawing on the work, particularly of the Climate Assembly that the UK had this year, to try and understand the perception of people of those changes. And the clue there is that group of people in the Climate Assembly, when they understood the issues and when they had the information in front of them, were actually really supportive of these sorts of changes. So a clue there, we have to start a conversation with the people living in the UK about the changes that lie ahead. So we come now to, I think, one of the most interesting and exciting parts of our latest report, which is the question of costs and the question of investment. This is where we've got some really powerful, I think, insights about what lies ahead for the UK. So let's think firstly about the challenge here. And the challenge is mainly one of investing to get to net zero. So in our work, what we've looked at is that transition over the next 30 years. And what we see is that we have to scale up investment across the UK economy. We actually have to scale up to about £50 billion extra of investment each year. That is mostly private investment. Now, 50 billion is a big number, but just to give you a sense of scale, last year, total capital investment in the UK was about £400 billion. So we're adding an eighth to that by 2030 and then keeping it at that level. That capital expenditure, which is the investment in renewables, the investment in electric cars, the network assets in our energy system that will help us get there, these are the things that will actually buy us net zero. We're turning over the capital stock of the whole country over the coming 30 years. And we've tried to do that in our assessments by replacing high carbon assets with low carbon assets as much as we can when those assets reach the end of their natural life. That's what keeps the cost low. So that 50 billion a year or thereabouts of investment gets us to net zero, but it also does something else, which is the really exciting stuff. So it also delivers a huge fuel saving to the British economy. So if we just look at that now, you can see that under the line, that's Britain not spending on fossil fuels. This is the fuel saving and the energy efficiency that goes with the new, more energy efficient technologies that we're using. Over time, those savings build up. So you can see that over time, they're actually coming to the point where they cancel out those investment costs entirely. That's really exciting because that has implications for the cost overall of the transition. There are also big impacts to the economy from investing at that kind of scale. So Mike, can you say something about the economic impacts that go with that?
Yeah, certainly, Chris. We've designed this, of course, as a climate policy, but it could just as easily be an economic policy, actually. Now, this is just what the economy needs at the moment. We've got spare capacity, we've got rising unemployment, and this program is going to boost activity, provide new employment across the economy, across the country. The housing retrofit program alone, we think will add over 200,000 jobs nationwide. Of course, we've also got record low interest rates. So now is a perfect time to be investing. And so while we might normally see this as a draw on resources, actually at the moment, this is a chance to put resources to good use. We add in those long-term fuel savings that Chris has just talked about. And there's a real prospect here that actually this program could boost GDP. While we tackle climate change, the UK could well end up better off, as well as healthier, in more comfortable homes, with cleaner air to breathe, with more green spaces, and with benefits for biodiversity. Now, we've also run the numbers without assuming any of those benefits. And what we see is that at worst, we'd be facing a very small cost, certainly small when we compare it to the benefits of tackling climate change. What we've done in this chart is that we've annualized the costs. So we've spread those investment costs over the lifetimes of the investments. We've allowed a return for investors in there. And to answer the usual questions, we've included all the elements of costs here. So this includes the costs of backup power generation, the costs of strengthening the electricity networks, but we've excluded things like taxes and subsidies. Those are transfers within the system. This is about the resource costs to the economy. And the headline here is that, the new analysis has cut our cost estimates again. Last year, we thought that it would cost around 1 to 2% of GDP to meet that net zero target in 2050. And now we think the costs will be less than 1% throughout the period. We had auctions for offshore wind just 6 months after our last report, and we found those were already beating the cautious cost estimates we've made. So now our central guess is that we'll be at a 0.5% of GDP cost at the max of this. That's equivalent to losing just 3 or 4 months of the next 100 months of economic growth. And there's every reason to think these could well fall again. As the world increasingly adopts a low carbon path, so the costs of low carbon technologies should come down quicker than the cautious assumptions we've made. And we shouldn't be surprised that these are low costs. We know that we can produce renewable electricity just as cheaply as we can get electricity from burning gas. And we're expecting electric cars to soon be cheaper to buy as well as cheaper to run. We simply don't need fossil fuels to access cheap energy anymore. Now, this doesn't mean that we should ignore the costs or indeed the benefits. Really important that those are shared fairly across the economy. And where there are negative effects, maybe for workers in the oil and gas sector, well, we need to support them through the transition. But the conclusion here is clear that any notion that we can't afford to tackle climate change is clearly nonsense.
Thanks so much, Mike. And that is absolutely one of our most important insights this year, a much lower cost overall. But of course, within that, the need to make sure that we distribute that cost and the benefits as fairly as possible. So I want to now move on to the changes that we're going to actually see in the UK over that transition to net zero. And again, hugely exciting to be able to take you on this kind of journey to net zero. So let's kind of walk along that path that we've just been setting out for you over the next 30 years. So we begin with these 2019 figures. You can see that we've achieved by 2019 a 41% reduction in UK territorial emissions since 1990. So I want to acknowledge that 2020 is going to be an odd year for all sorts of reasons, but it's going to have a big impact on that chart. So we are going to see reduced emissions from the pandemic, from all the lockdowns that have been driving down particularly our transport emissions. That makes confident predictions about the future, of course, very difficult. So we have been prudent about COVID. We haven't assumed that those impacts on emissions last. Things eventually return to trend. They take longer in some sectors than others. Think about the aviation emissions. We're not expecting them to return for a while. But the challenge here is not to rely on a pandemic to cut emissions. The challenge is to drive change, to drive emissions down permanently with a set of key changes that last. And that's going to take leadership from government. So let's march on then to 2025 and roll forward to where we are by that point. So we're making good progress by this point on all of the areas that we need to cut emissions. And that really is the challenge, not progressing single sectors, single challenges, but a set of changes happening across the economy in concert to reduce emissions. By that point, coal has been phased out of the power system completely. That's a major moment for the UK, of course. New homes are being constructed to the Future Homes Standard. We've got just under a third of boiler replacements already being low carbon. Any new boilers sold from 2025 would need to be hydrogen ready, having the option of a hydrogen conversion later. We're planting 30,000 hectares a year of new woodland. Half of new sales of cars are already electric. We've started trials of zero carbon heavy goods vehicles as well. We've got new business models in place for hydrogen production, for carbon capture, also for greenhouse gas removals. Now, interestingly, we're not seeing the emissions reduction from all of that activity yet because that takes time. So the trajectory is still quite flat, and that's because we're scaling up. We're making up for lost ground and all those challenges that we haven't done enough on so far. So scaling up is really the theme of the mid-2020s. We're scaling up hydrogen production, we're scaling up offshore wind installation, scaling up heat pump installations, scaling up electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We've got the first carbon capture and storage industrial clusters opening production. All very exciting. Let's move on to 2030. And this is really a kind of big turning point in the story ahead. So emissions have reduced by 64% by 2030 if we include international aviation and shipping. If we exclude those emissions, it's 68%. That's the target that we recommended that the Prime Minister set for 2030, the UK's NDC. 2030 is really the key point. So around that time, all new investments, all asset purchases, all cars, all new heating installations, all new plant and machinery and businesses are zero carbon. So think of that challenge over the next decade to get to that point. That's what we need to do to hit the net zero goal on time. So asset lives really become important after that. We're going to determine the progress about how quickly we can go, depending on how we replace those assets over time. And 2030 is the date we have to get to zero carbon investments by and large. Almost 100% of sales of cars and vans are electric by that point, battery electrics. Hybrids, very much a niche thing. We're hitting 1 million heat pump installations each year by 2030. And the government has already ended new sales of oil heating in homes. We're seeing 11 million insulation measures fitted each year. 40 gigawatts of offshore wind is now installed in UK waters. That's one of the challenges that's in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for the UK. We have at least 5 low-carbon industrial clusters across the UK, and they're capturing serious amounts of CO2 now. So 10 million tonnes a year are being captured in those industrial clusters and stored under the sea safely. We're producing 30 terawatt hours of low-carbon hydrogen, and we've got commercial-scale greenhouse gas removals happening in those clusters too. By that point, meat consumption has fallen by about 1/5, and we're seeing farmland now progressively being flipped over to woodland creation, some energy crop production, and of course all of that has to come with appropriate rewards for the farmer. Now we reach 2035, and this is really the critical moment. So 15 years from now, we're at maximum momentum on our zero carbon journey. Hopefully you can see that with those metrics on the right-hand side. Emissions are really falling fast now. We've reduced emissions by 4/5 since 1990. The electricity system has grown by 1/2 by that point from today. We have stopped burning gas to generate electricity unabated. So we've reached zero carbon electricity production by 2035. So that is the same date that Joe Biden has targeted for the US. We are seeing 14 million installations of home insulation each year. That's substantially reducing the heat demand from UK homes overall. Sales of natural gas boilers to all homes, that's new sales, end in 2033, so just before that point. After that point, it's only possible to buy a gas boiler if you live in an area that's scheduled to be converted to hydrogen or moved across to district heating. For all other areas, it's going to be heat pumps most likely that will be the choice of low carbon heating installation. That is a massive new installation market for the UK. In industry, we've got steel making turning to zero carbon. Hydrogen production's grown to over 100 terawatts a year, so that's now a serious new component in the UK energy sector. We see widespread rollout of carbon capture and storage by that point, and that includes for energy from waste plants, the places where we're incinerating waste. We've reduced our meat consumption by nearly 1/4 by 2035, and we might well be substituting that meat with lab-grown meat by that point. And the area of forest being planted has risen to 50,000 hectares a year, so almost a huge shift, and almost 60% of UK peatland has been restored with it, so big biodiversity benefits that go with that. And finally, we reached the goal of 2050, and any residual emissions from aviation or agriculture by this point are being offset through emissions removals in the UK. That's a big challenge, but one we think can get to. There's, by that point, a bit of further diet change. 80% of peatland has been restored. We continue to plant new woodland at scale, of course. Throughout the 2040s, we've had that low carbon electricity to benefit from. We're up to nearly 100 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. We also have lots of low carbon hydrogen, which we're using throughout the economy, particularly for transport and particularly for industry. And we're producing that increasingly with zero carbon processes, so electrolysis. We're making sparing use of biomass and bioenergy, using that particularly where we get the biggest carbon bang for our buck by combining that with carbon capture. Crucially, what we've done by 2050 is normalize zero carbon. So all new purchases are zero carbon as a matter of course. It's a genuinely net zero society by 2050. That is the plan. And in our report, we go further to explain the policies that could drive that transition overall. And the crucial point about this is it's genuinely feasible. That's what's so exciting about the thing that we're producing in this latest report. But it's also a clue that all of this is hugely challenging. And anyone who thinks that reaching that goal of 2050 net zero isn't challenging hasn't really thought through the implications, I would say, of that change over the next 30 years. So let's move on now, Mike. And perhaps you could tell us a bit about the energy implications of all that, because they really are amazing.
Yeah, Thanks, Chris. They're pretty amazing, as you say. I'll rattle through these, but the details are all in the report, of course. First, gas. This is our biggest change from the net zero report last year. We've got more renewable electricity, we've got more electrolysis of hydrogen, and that allows us to get to net zero with less gas with CCS. But we're only using it with CCS by 2050. The total impact here is we get a reduction of around 75% by 2050 compared to today. So gas is not acting as a bridge fuel. It's a fossil fuel and we need to move away from it. If we move on to oil, it will need to fall quickly, first in light vehicles and then in the rest of the economy. And by 2050, we only see it being used as jet fuel in planes. That gives us an 85% reduction compared to today. And while oil and gas scale down, low carbon energy scales up. So electricity does the most lifting there. It's up 50% by 2030, and we think it will need to at least double by 2050. It might need to increase threefold if it's used more to produce low carbon hydrogen and maybe synthetic jet fuels. Also note the shorter axis here. Because electricity is so efficient when used as electrification, we don't need as much extra electricity to offset those big reductions in oil and gas. But we can't electrify everything, so we also need low carbon hydrogen. Trials in the coming years scale up quickly from the mid-2020s, and then by 2050, the low carbon hydrogen sector is around 2/3 the size of the electricity sector of today. We're largely using it in manufacturing, in shipping, probably as ammonia, and for backup power generation when the wind isn't blowing. We might have a bit in trucks and in heating as well. To start with, it's largely coming from blue hydrogen. That's production with carbon capture and storage from gas. And over time, we see an increasing role for green hydrogen, using renewable energy to produce hydrogen through electrolysis.
Thanks so much, Mike. And that brings us full circle, really. So we want to talk in this last section about climate change itself, which is, of course, a global challenge. And I'm speaking to you today from Glasgow, where next year we're going to be hosting world leaders to talk about climate change and what I hope will be the most important of those climate summits that we have had, because this is about the progress that we need to make finally on tackling this issue, properly meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's going to be the challenge for Glasgow next year. I want to spend some time on how we think that story has been changing recently. Mike, I'm going to come back to you just to talk us through in this final section how that story on climate change, how that narrative that we've been talking about has been shifting actually quite rapidly recently. So over to you again, Mike.
Thanks, Chris. And this starts gloomy, but then it gets more cheerful. We're already in a bad place at the moment. The world has warmed by over 1 degree. We're seeing the impacts of that around the world and in the UK, of course. And the science tells us that every fraction of a degree that we add from here will make things worse. Now, without action, things were set to get much, much worse. When the Climate Committee started looking at this over a decade ago, emissions were rising relentlessly, and we were looking at a possible central case of 4 degrees of warming. That's quite frankly a horrifying prospect. And actually, we couldn't even rule out warming as high as 6 degrees. That has fortunately gone now. The reduction in price of renewables, the pledges to the Paris Agreement, these mean that the emissions would be roughly flat in future. And that would give us more like a 3 degree level of warming, but there would still be a risk of 4. Now, if we fast forward to this year, there's been a really remarkable shift in the last 18 months or so. In that period since the UK set our net zero target, we're now really seeing those spread around the world. So we've had net zero pledges from the EU, from Japan and South Korea, from China, albeit for 2060, not 2050. And of course, we're expecting it in the new year from the US administration. That means that over half of global emissions are now covered by net zero pledges and 3/4 of the global economy. Now, if those are delivered, even without immediate action to get off that flat curve, then what we'll see is that we could just about sneak under that 2 degree target that the world was aiming for not so long ago. Paris, of course, though, is aiming for more than that. And to get well below 2 degrees, we need more action now. As Chris said at the start, cumulative emissions are what matters for climate. And so what we do when emissions are their highest is the thing that has the most impact on emissions and therefore on the climate. And to have a shot at 1.5 degrees, we've got to bend that curve even more, and we've got to make sure that the whole world can deliver net zero around 2050. We need to deliver those targets, and we need to start cutting emissions now. And that's why this report and what the UK does really matters. We've set out the most thorough vision yet of the path to net zero. It's got a strong front-leading trajectory, as we need to see in the world as a whole. And by setting off on that path, the UK can provide a positive example of the path to net zero that can encourage others to do the same. The actions that the UK will need to do to deliver that target, to deliver that path, will put us in a group of leading countries that will be demonstrating, developing the technologies that will be needed across the rest of the world tomorrow. We don't know, of course, what the world will agree in Glasgow, but by adopting the committee's recommendations on the sixth carbon budget and by adopting the plans we need to deliver it, the UK will be playing our full part. Back to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So that's it. That's the recommendation and the analysis that we are providing in our latest report. And as Mike says, that's the importance of it. This is a template, we think, for decarbonising a modern economy like the UK. And it's one, of course, that other countries can follow. And if that happens, then we can have a much more optimistic discussion, I hope, than we've had recently in Glasgow next year. So those recommendations are now with government, and it's for them to think about whether they can agree with those recommendations and legislate the sixth carbon budget as we've recommended. I hope they do that. But I just want to end by saying thanks, of course, to Mike, and thanks to my team who've been amazing in helping produce this really wonderful analysis. Thanks also to you for tuning in to listen to it today. Please go and download the reports, I should say. There are more than one. There is a wealth of information there. We've also got some tools ready so that you can play with those numbers and really get into them. That will give you, I think, even more information that you can play with. Next for the CCC is a focus on how you actually deliver all this. That's the really important thing for us. So we want to become more of an independent expert on the challenge of delivering those kind of emissions reductions. And with it, we're going to up our scrutiny on government about the progress that the government is making in putting those policies in place to deliver those kind of emissions reduction. That's next. For now, I just want to say thanks so much for tuning in. Okay, so I hope you were impressed by that. I hope you were impressed by our blue jumpers. We're now going to move on to the question and answer session, which I'm so pleased we can do this morning. And to moderate that, we have Polita Clark with us, who is an associate editor at the Financial Times, columnist there too. And of course, she's been around this energy and climate stuff for a while, so she's the perfect person, I hope, to host this Q&A, to take your questions and put them to us. So over to you, Polita.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. And hello to everyone watching. So this is indeed the moment where you get to ask the many questions that are raised by a report that really is, I think, quite distinctive by international standards. Many countries now do, of course, have a net zero emission plan like the UK's, but it's quite hard to think of many that have done the hard work of figuring out how to achieve this goal, let alone produced a thumping 1,000-page report like the one that the Climate Change Committee is launching today. And as you've just heard, it does, of course, spell out some quite significant changes, notably in the sorts of consumer behaviour that are going to be needed to put the UK on a path towards net zero emissions. And they do include things like 20% cut in meat and dairy consumption in just 9 years' time, and no more new gas boilers after 2033. There's a lot more, of course. It comes with large price tag, around £50 billion a year in annual investment by 2030, up from around £10 billion today. But we have just over 45 minutes to look at what all of this means now with Chris, the committee's chief executive, and Lord Deben, its chair, Mike Thompson, who you've also just met, its chief economist, and we also have the committee's deputy chair, Baroness Brown, who is an engineer who led a 2008 government review of low carbon cars that really put the shaped the electric vehicle market in this country. So welcome to you all. We'll be taking audience questions throughout the rest of the time we have now. So do please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, those of you watching on Zoom. We'll be trying to get through as many questions as we possibly can. We have a few already, and I'm going to ask Chris to answer the first one, which comes from Carolyn Lucas, who'll be known to everybody. The section on aviation emissions is what Carolyn wants to talk about. She says it doesn't seem very ambitious. There's a 15% reduction on 2018 passenger levies by 2050 is what it talks about. And she's asking what consideration the committee gave to new evidence from the EU Aviation Safety Agency that aviation emissions are actually causing 3 times more harm than currently estimated. So given that almost half the population didn't fly at all in 2018 and effectively subsidised the rest who do, and given that the Climate Assembly supported a frequent flyer levy, wouldn't that be a much faster and fairer way to reduce aviation emissions? Chris?
So it's a great question, and thanks, Caroline, for asking it. So, I mean, aviation is one of the most thorny topics, and we've tried to cover it in as thorough a way as, well, I think this is the most thorough discussion of aviation emissions that we've ever produced. A few things to say about it. Of course, it would help if we could cut emissions from aviation, and we explore that new science that you referred to there, Caroline, about the wider impacts of aviation emissions in the document. I fully recommend that you go and look at that. The central message here is that the sooner that we cut aviation emissions, the better. Now, well, that's an easy thing to say. Cutting aviation emissions is an easy thing to say. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that for the purposes of benefiting the climate? What we try to do in this report is explore a world where we respond to the need to suppress those aviation emissions, but acknowledge the fact that people do want to fly. So we use some evidence actually from the Climate Assembly that you referred to, Polita. We saw that group of just over 100 people who were faced with the challenge of how to get to net zero, when they expressed their preference, they didn't want to nibble off entirely, didn't want to reduce those the aviation journeys. What they wanted to do was to try and suppress the demand increase. So that's what we've got in our main balance pathway. We also explore a world in one of those scenarios that we talked about where we do more of that, so reduce demands for aviation even further than that. So that would of course help the climate. It's more or less where we are today as well. We've really suppressed the demand for aviation a lot during the pandemic, and it's one of the big uncertainties about how that recovers over time. But just to acknowledge the kind of premise of your question, that of course it matters that we cut those aviation emissions, and it matters for more than just the CO2 that they're putting into the atmosphere, but also those wider impacts from aviation that we've explored in the report. So I think this is one of those areas where we're going to see more over time. For now, this balanced pathway fits very well with what the Climate Assembly told us, and I should say fits very well with previous reports that we've produced as well on aviation.
Okay, Lord Deben, I know that you have a deep and abiding interest in aviation policy. I just wonder, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, no, except to explain that when we looked at these things, we wanted people to recognise in the balanced pathway something that they could see would and could happen. Of course, if we can do more on aviation, that would be really valuable. But if you start off with saying that you're going to do something which is really, in many people's minds, almost impossible, then all the rest of it is thrown into doubt. So what we've done all the time is to be conservative about what we think behaviour change can be achieved. That's why it's only a 20% reduction in meat eating, when we could have gone for a much bigger one. But if we said a bigger one, then again, you throw the whole balance into some kind of question. The other ways of doing it, we have explored. We've explored what happens if you do much more, and if you really do have something which could, where modern technology and changes really contribute a great deal. But the balanced route is the one which we believe will be, although really very seriously ambitious, is one which the government can stick to, can get through, and can deliver net zero.
Okay, well, moving on to another one, but staying with this point about changes in consumer behaviour. And Baroness Brown, I wonder if I can ask you this. It comes from Gareth Morgan from the Soil Association. And the Soil Association is very pleased that the committee's included white meat in the reduction target in recognition of the climate impact on animal feed, things like imported soy. But Gareth's asking, would the committee be keen to see the National Food Strategy pick this up, and by recommending, for example, less but better meat on school menus as one way to change behaviour?
We're very keen on this idea of less but better meat. We've had all sorts of horrendous scares about the quality of meat in meat pies and in frozen products over the last few years. Taking this opportunity for less but better meat, I think is really important. And of course, in general, British farmers produce meat of outstanding quality. So hopefully that would be, that's something they excel at. We also need to drive this reduction in meat consumption, because we need to free up land to enable all of the tree planting and the natural routes that we're going to that we're expecting to use to combat those remaining positive emissions when we get to 2050. So enabling us to get absolutely to net zero in the UK.
Okay. Now we've got a couple of quite popular questions here that I can tell through the magic of Zoom are some of the ones that people do want answered. So here's one from Rob Gross, the director of the UK Energy Research Centre. If you were to meet for a substantial meal in a pub, Lord Deben, what three things would you ask Boris Johnson to do first?
If I were to meet Boris Johnson in this pub, this is a very surprising suggestion.
Yes, I'm sorry, I mangled that a little. If you and Boris Johnson were to meet in a pub and then have a substantial meal together, I don't know. Well, anyway, the meal is just an interesting sidelight. But what three things really would you be asking him to do first?
Well, if I were talking only about climate change, I've got a number of other things I might want to ask him about. But if I were talking about climate change, I'd be saying get on with the change in heating, because there are so many people in Britain at the moment who live in cold houses who are deprived in parts of the country which are themselves deprived. And this is also the biggest creator of jobs which you need to do at this moment. So get on with the heating. Secondly, for goodness sake, have very clear route maps for all these issues. I mean, there's no point in saying no electric cars after 2030 to be sold unless you've got a program to reach that, and that you know how much it will have to increase year by year, and that you get that agreed and delivered. And similarly, the third area, which is hugely important, is to get on with the land use area, trying to ensure that we use our land more sensibly, that we do eat less meat, but we eat better meat, that we do really recover the fertility of our soil, which we've lost because of modern techniques, because that will bring the that will bring back the carbon sequestration which soil can do. Do those three things and get on with them now. But I'd actually only need to say one thing, and that is get on with it now. absolutely with the money, with the programme, and with the ambition, and with the encouragement.
Okay, I'm tempted to ask more of you that question, but we might come back to that. But first of all, Mike, I want to ask you another popular question here from someone who's asking, can you explain how you use the recommendations from the Climate Assembly to build your advice?
Yeah, thank you. It's such a good question. I think it really plays to the question before about behaviour as well. We've looked really carefully at the Climate Assembly's recommendations, and actually we were quite engaged in the process as well, lots of the team helping out with that. The Assembly is a really helpful thing for us because in a way we were a little bit blind before about what are the changes that people are prepared to make, and what the Climate Assembly tells us is that actually if you take the time to guide people through this, to explain why the changes are needed, to explain the sorts of things that need to happen, they're really supportive of action. And actually we were surprised how supportive they were of lots of the things that we were thinking of already. So what we've done is we've taken their advice and we've constructed our scenarios to align to it. So you'll see on diet change, on flying, on driving, the sorts of trends that they said they would be happy with in future, we've reflected those into our scenarios. But it also really matters for the way that we design policy. Some really clear themes that came out from the Assembly that they want to be engaged, they want to be involved and understand what's happening, but also be involved in development. So we need to talk to people about how they want us to go about policy development, policy implementation. And they want things to be fair. That's a really important theme for the Climate Assembly. And you'll see it as a really important theme in this report as well. And they want to have choice. So this idea that balanced pathway is developing options that we can then pick between as time goes on is a really important one as well. So it's really a theme of consistent signal, of being fair across the piece and fair to different people in different places and different circumstances. And that's the sort of thing we need to build those recommendations into policy design in the same way that the CCC have built them into our scenarios.
Just to follow up on that, Mike, I mean, was there ever a moment when you were putting the report together, or particularly from your end, where you had a question and then you kind of referred to what had come out of the Assembly and thought, well, actually, we won't do it that way, we'll do it this way?
Well, I think the diet change is maybe the most obvious one there. And the Climate Assembly said they would be happy with a 20 to a 40% reduction in meat consumption. And you see exactly that in our report. So we have a 20% reduction to 2030, and it's growing up to 35% by 2050 in that balanced pathway. And we explore the two ends of that as well in the other pathways. So I think it's that kind of really granular thing where they're quite specific actually about what they feel they'd be comfortable with that we've been able to draw on.
Yeah.
Khalifa, can I add a bit to that, please? Just to take that on a bit more. So, I mean, I and a few others in the team are really heavily involved in supporting the Climate Assembly. It's worth saying that anyone tuning in who doesn't know about the Climate Assembly, it's worth going back to look at what they produced. It was a process commissioned by Parliament, which gave it a kind of status that I felt was something, therefore, that we should try and support as much as we could. I don't mind admitting, when we began that process of supporting them, I was a bit suspicious, I suppose, about where that might end up. We hadn't done that style of research before. And it turns out if you get together a group of and I think genuinely representative people from around the UK, one of the best things about that process was how well selected the people on the Assembly members themselves were. I think amazing to me, you get together that group of people, and then you can put before them some of the information that we've been talking about today, some of the background to why climate change is a problem and what's driving it. And it turned out that through a completely different process to the one that we are known for, the CCC, they're very numbers focused, lots of spreadsheets, lots of quantitative analysis. They're a completely different process, more qualitative and values led, of course. You actually get to a very similar set of outcomes. And that was amazing to me. And a kind of real affirmation actually of two things, I suppose. One, that we were broadly in the right place in our technical analysis. And two, that we should trust people more to make those kind of decisions. So the point I was going to make actually is that I think that we, the CCC, could do more of that deliberative style of research, of analysis in the future. I'm interested in the views from the audience about whether that's something that people would like to see us do more of. I think it takes us more into questions of what works well, what policies might work well, how we implement policy, which is something I'm very keen, and I know that Lord Deben is keen as well, that we should do more of in the future. So we be expert in how you deliver this stuff, and I mentioned that at the end of the presentation. So, you know, that's a really interesting thing for me that we went through that process this year.
All right. Well, speaking of delivery, very good question here that I would have asked myself. There are a lot of policy priorities for the government to deliver in the next few years, regardless really of even what happens with the pandemic overlying everything as well. How ready do you think that government departments are to deliver all of this? Chris and Lord Deben, I'm going to ask you first, and then Baroness Brown, if you could all three of you quickly tell us what you think. And Mike, at the end, if there's anything they've missed, could you add your thoughts as well? So starting perhaps with Chris.
So we understand a bit more about what's happening behind the scenes in government than many people do. And I'm not here to be an apologist for the government, but I know how much work there is happening in government, and you start to see that cropping up. We've been presenting some of this work behind the scenes to government to get them ready for this report that we published today. And a slide I've been using a lot recently is just the list of strategies and policies and commitments that the government's already made for the next year ahead. So this is the year before we host the climate summit here in Glasgow in November next year. And it's just a stonking list of things that need to be delivered and are already committed to. The Prime Minister's now kind of given a sort of commitment that really helps, I think, actually kind of lift the ambition of all those things in his 10-point plan. So my sort of more optimistic take on this, perhaps, than you might expect, Lita, is that I think government's more ready than many people think for what's ahead, but they're probably not at the right level of ambition yet. So one of the important things in our report is to say that really the heavy work on policy has got to be done in this Parliament and perhaps a little bit in the next. So you know that 2050 goal really rests on raising the ambition in policy terms over this parliamentary term. So I'm not sure that message is quite filtered through yet. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that the challenge of coordinating all this around government is one that I don't think the government's quite at the races with yet. So if that's going to be something I think we'll want to look at too.
Yeah, I mean, that question of coordination is really interesting, Lord Deben, because although, as Chris says, the Prime Minister's talking about a green revolution and his 10-point plan, and as you said, he's endorsed large chunks of your report already, but at the same time, his Chancellor is talking about a £27 billion road building programme. And at best, that suggests kind of mixed priorities, I would suggest. And at worst, it would suggest that really they may not be thinking as cohesively within government about how to achieve what the committee's report is recommending?
Well, I think the crucial thing is that they have not yet reached the point at which every decision starts with the question of how this fits the climate change campaign. And until that happens, of course, the coordination won't arise. That's why last year, for the first time, we changed the way in which we appraise what the government has done by doing it not overall, although we do it overall, but doing it department by department, because many departments have clearly not until very recently understood that they have a crucial part to play. So even if it's the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, the way they spend their money has to start off with, does this contribute towards this great battle to reach net zero? So I think that the government has got the goodwill. I think it intends to do these things. I think the Prime Minister's 10 points was a great step forward, and his commitment to this figure of 68% reduction in emissions on 1990 by 2030 is a very, very real commitment, but they haven't yet got the structure to do it. And it's that structure and that force and push, and above all, as you say, Polita, that you don't announce anything unless you can do so within the context of that. So if you're going to spend money on roads, you have to explain how that is going to fit in with the programme to reach net zero by 2050, which is your legal requirement. We have to remember that. They are signed up to it, and we're intending to keep their feet to the fire.
Baroness Brown, just on that point of perhaps structural change, I mean, you've been involved with the committee since it started in 2008. Would you like to see a change within government so that there was, say, a minister or department or a senior figure that was in a sort of more coordinating role, perhaps? Is that something you've ever thought about at the committee?
We've discussed the coordination a lot. I mean, I suppose I'd like to see the climate cabinet and the structure they've put in place really working. I mean, I really do like this to be led from by the Prime Minister, from the Prime Minister's office, because it has to integrate across all of government. But I think there are also some, not all of this is got to be done by government. And I think, as you know better than I do, we're seeing a very, very important response now coming from industry, with, I believe, and you probably know the figure better than I do, with, I believe, now at least 50% of FTSE 100 companies signed up themselves to net zero targets. And of course, a lot of this also needs to be delivered or facilitated by local government. And we're seeing lots of ambition from local government, with local government setting net zero targets and declaring climate emergencies. And I would say local government needs help. It needs to be properly funded by central government in order that it can put in place the teams who can help deliver locally.
Yeah. Just in the interest of time, Mike, I'm going to just move on to a question that's been asked of you specifically from Simon Roberts, who says that you said in your presentation that hydrogen will be used in industry for shipping, backup power generation, possibly for trucks. So why is there still so much focus on hydrogen boilers for home heating?
Okay, interesting. We've certainly emphasised that efficiency and electrification should be the main routes for homes. The reason we've got hydrogen boilers in there is that it's quite a small cost to make sure that your boiler is hydrogen ready. And until we've ramped up the supply chain for heat pumps, particularly, that will take us a decade. So we are still going to be installing gas boilers through the 2020s, in the early 2030s. So it makes sense to make sure that those are hydrogen ready, so that if we find that actually we have problems with the heat pump program, or we find that we can actually produce hydrogen very, very quick, very cheaply at very large scales, and we decide that actually there's more of a role for hydrogen boilers, then it makes sense to have made sure that those gas boilers that are already there can use hydrogen. And that might well be in a backup role. So you might use them alongside a heat pump as a hybrid system. But rather than kind of make the same mistakes that we've made with new homes, where we could have been building low carbon homes for years, we're saying, look, we know that we're going to be able to have hydrogen ready boilers at least by 2025. Let's make that a requirement and make sure that that we've done that, and we've given ourselves that optionality. But the emphasis in heating is very much on electrification, district heating, and efficiency.
Yeah, and when you say it's going to be a small cost to make your boiler hydrogen ready, how small is it? I mean, how much is it going to cost me to make my boiler hydrogen ready if I wanted to do it next week, for example?
Yeah, we think it's about £100 probably, and you compare that to a typical boiler installation cost of maybe 2,000. It's a relatively small difference, and obviously, in 5 years' time, with inflation as well, that's almost in the rounding, really.
Just before we leave gas boilers, because I noticed, in today's coverage, of course, there's a lot of interest in how this transition is going to work. And now you've, Mike, I'm still asking you this, but Chris, you might want to come in afterwards as well. But you're suggesting in the report that it's going to cost on average around £10,000 to install an alternative to a gas boiler, whether it's an air source heat pump or whatever. And I think that figure includes insulation for the home as well. Now that is a lot of money, and I know that, as you've said, you want to make sure that everything's affordable. What sort of policies do we need to see the government talking about right now to encourage not just people individually to do this, but more importantly, the private investment needed to really spur this market? Mike? Yeah,
so you're right. The numbers we've got is that we're looking at an average investment cost of under £10,000 per home. That covers both the insulation and the and the heat pump or whatever other low carbon system it is. And that stands out as the part of this transition where the government really is going to have to help people to pay for that. We can't just lump that onto every individual household. And I think really we look at a couple of things here. You look at the vulnerable customers, the fuel poor, the people that are having trouble heating their homes. And what we've suggested is, look, for them, this cost should be entirely covered by the government. We have schemes already that we spend about £2-3 billion a year on. And actually, if you take those schemes and you target them at the fuel poor, at the vulnerable households, you can cover all of those £10,000 investment costs for all of those households. So you can fully pay for this for the fuel poor and the vulnerable. And if you do so, well, they've got better insulated, more efficient homes, more efficient heating systems. Their annual bill will actually go down in that case. The question then is, what do you do for the rest of the system? And that will depend on which part it is. You might look at the rented stock and say, well, is there a way that we can push this on to landlords? We've got regulations that say that landlords have to increase the efficiency of their properties. Longer term, we will have to have regulations that say you also need to improve the carbon efficiency, so you have to move to heat pumps. Now, you might share some of those costs with landlords rather than push them all on, but that certainly is something that we will need to do. And then for the rest of the stock, you'd look at something like the Green Homes Grant, where the government has said, look, we'll pay for 2/3 in the coming year of these types of investments. That might not be the right number for the longer term, but that kind of sharing of costs between government, between households, that's the sort of thing that the Climate Assembly like. They like that this is seen as a shared endeavour, and that's kind of practically probably the right way through this.
Yeah. I mean, Chris, there's actually a related question to this from Phil McNally, who's asking about the route to net zero, saying it's great that you're saying now that it's going to cost less than 1% of GDP, but realistically, how do you see a future economy working where fossil fuels, which of course currently still underpin the economy, are really largely displaced by effectively free commodities like wind and solar? And does this require a move to centralised infrastructure procurement, or is it possible to commodify wind and solar in some way?
God, that's an absolutely brilliant question. I mean, there isn't an easy answer to that question, but just to acknowledge that I think the premise of that is correct, that we're moving, of course, away from fossil fuels to a world where the economics of energy are going to be different. Now, at the moment, we have a system of policy for electricity generation that supports that, with, in particular, the contract for difference. You can imagine pricing mechanisms that will help along the way. But that doesn't mean to say that for the next 30 years we're going to have those things in place and indeed in perpetuity. There are other ways to cut this. I think that fundamental challenge of the economics of a zero carbon energy system is one that we actually need the government to set out its vision on too. So that's, I think, for me, one of the most important things in the energy white paper that's due imminently. I might just go back just to something that just to pick up where Mike left off on this energy transition that we need in heat. Now, we've been talking about this for a very long time. It's no great surprise that the CCC is saying today we've got to get going on decarbonising heat. We've been saying that for some time now. I think the question you asked, Mike, included a really interesting nugget, Polita, about what we do to get investors and commerce to the point where they think that's a serious transition too. And I think for me, that's the biggest challenge. So we've got this really nice story happening on UK renewables now, which is a really brilliant story of scaling up at roughly the appropriate way, appropriate level, to the point where you get this kind of learning by doing happening at scale that's cutting the cost of electricity generation using renewables. We've not really seen that kind of transition happen on heat. So I think we need to start where the government's got to actually spell out that it's being serious about decarbonising heat and that it's serious about improving energy efficiency of buildings alongside that. That's the importance of the planned heat and building strategy that we should take in government this year. One of the big steps forward in this analysis is that we've also named some of the key phase-out dates that go with that. Now, for me, I think that's the important thing for investors. They need to see that. They need to understand when in the UK we will stop selling natural gas boilers that aren't ready for that hydrogen conversion or indeed a conversion to alternatives like district heating. We need that kind of certainty to be introduced And then we've got this other challenge of how you kind of flip the cost so that the low carbon alternative is cheaper than the high carbon one. These are policy questions that we can answer. We've got lots of good evidence on what you could do about it. But I think it starts with the government acknowledging that they're actually going to do it now. And for me, just the last point on this, that was the importance of the Prime Minister in his 10-point plan, talking about 600,000 heat pump installations by 2030. That's a good start. We've talked about 1 million heat pump installations by 2030, but that's the kind of measure that indicates genuine ambition. Let's now see that turned into a proper commitment.
Yeah. Okay. I'm quite tempted, maybe just a show of hands, who amongst you still has a gas boiler? Okay. And what, Baroness Brown?
Way through.
You what?
Ours is being changed at this very moment as we sit. So if you hear the noise offside, that is the actual installation of an air source heat pump. And we will be over to biogas because we can't do just with that in this house. Because we can't have underfloor heating and such like, because it's a Victorian house which doesn't have a bit of that. But the air source heat pump is going in at this moment, which is why there's no heat here.
That's not very encouraging, but anyway.
Well, it's only because it's going in. So
yeah, that is encouraging. But Baroness Brown, what have you got?
We've had our heat pump about a month, and it's doing fine. We're getting used to it. It runs on our, it's a well-insulated house, so it runs with our original radiators, and we're getting used to it. It's been very nice and warm and lots of lovely hot water.
Okay.
I will say I don't have a heat pump, but I have an electric car, and it is absolutely brilliant.
Well, that was my next question. All right, who's got an electric car then?
I think Mike and Julia both got one. My car's in its last few months. So I was I did a podcast with Laura Kunsberg, and she asked me that very question. So very happy to hand back my diesel car very shortly.
Mine's a hybrid, and it will be electric once, but it doesn't do anything at the moment. This is a totally useless question. It just sits in the drive because I'm not leaving home much, so it's hardly done any miles this year. So I don't think I've done too much to the damage to the helm, even in the hybrid system.
All right, okay.
I just think the brilliant thing about the electric car is that you never have to go to the petrol station. And also, when you come out and you've got 40 miles on the clock, in our previous car, I would have thought, oh gosh, anywhere I go, I'm going to be looking for a petrol station, and they're harder and harder to find. I go out, it's got 40 miles. I think, oh, that's plenty to get me to the supermarket and back. I don't have to worry. And it just changes your mindset. It's just been great, actually. Really great.
Actually, you made an interesting comment at the media briefing the other day, Baroness Brown, that in future we may get to the point where it's harder to find a petrol station if you've got a petrol car than it is now to find a charging point, which is quite an interesting idea. I just want to get through some more questions here. We've got some really very interesting ones. Just in our remaining 10 or so minutes. Question here from someone saying, how will we reward farmers for their loss of income? I think Lord Deben, you're out in the countryside.
Well, I think this is one of the fundamental challenges of the Agriculture Act. I mean, it has all sorts of high-minded views about how we're going to have elms, in other words, to pay for people's willingness to do public good. Nobody's really faced the issue that if you remove the present system of subsidy, very large numbers of farms will in fact not make a profit at all. So we've got to look very seriously about how people are going to be encouraged if we want to produce at home the food that we could. Because after all, the last thing we want to do is to be importing more food. That doesn't help the climate at all. So we've got to find a much better way of working with farmers, and they on their side have got to look very much more clearly on the subject of animal husbandry. We've got to become the kind of country where you know that whatever you buy has been produced in the most climate friendly, the most animal welfare, the most safe way. And then that is something that we've also got to help them by making sure that they're not undercut by imports from elsewhere. So some of the sharp debates that we've been having about trade and about agriculture are absolutely central to the climate change commitment too. And what I'm sorry about so far is that it has not been on that point. And the present system is certainly not right to give farmers the support and the encouragement and indeed the confidence they need to invest for the future.
Yeah. And I mean, is Brexit likely to complicate that? I mean, I know we don't know on the terms on which we're leaving quite yet, but, you know, do you think that there's a chance that it will?
Oh, yes, I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think this is a terrible mistake. The fact is that the way we are going to have to work in the future is by cooperation with our neighbours, and saying you're not going to do that in a sensible way is not a helpful thing. So all we're trying to do now is to patch up the situation. I very much hope we have a deal. Of course, if there is no deal, then I think this is incredibly difficult. But the one thing you can't do is to expect your farmers to grow food and yet at high standards of animal welfare, of climate change support, all those things of environmental and biodiversity support. You can't expect them to do all that and then import goods which have been produced by cutting down the rainforest in Brazil or by having very low standards of safety from the United States. You just can't do that.
Yeah. Okay. This is just a very interesting question from Chris Ashley, who's pointing out that behavioural change is going to be important, and he wants to know, or she, I should say, wants to know what should be done to ensure that people are signed up to making the changes needed. And just in particular, though, could the committee spell out the key risks, the most important risks that loom when it comes to that may prevent the net zero pathway being achieved? Chris, what in your mind are the really just the one or two huge risks that lie ahead that could stop this from happening?
Well, let's start, Polita, from the grand challenge. The biggest risk is that we don't get the proper political commitment. So more than just setting targets, we need policies now to deliver those things. And time has run out for those policies to be set. We've been promised them for a while now. So this year ahead is the point when those commitments, those political commitments need to be turned into hard policy. So that's my number one risk. Going back to the question about behaviour change, fascinating in this report. I mean, we looked really hard at behaviour change. Mike's already spoken about some of the ways in which we've been exploring it, including using the work from the Climate Assembly. What's important to say here is that this rests in large part on a change in behaviour. There's an absolutely, that pie chart I showed, I love it because I think it explains a lot about the transition ahead. You've got a bit of this, about 2/5 that's pure technology, and the rest of it is a mixture of technology and behaviour change and some pure behaviour change. Of those, I'll just pull out the diet shift that we've been talking about. So by 2030, a 20% fall in our consumption of meat, and then we go a bit further after that on the meat consumption to reduce it further by around a third by mid-century. Of course, it's a sensible thing to do from the climate's perspective, but it's important for one other reason, that it frees up land. Really keen to make this point, because if you don't free up the land, then you don't get the opportunity to store more carbon in that land. And then the whole thing is at risk. So it's funny how much that one issue is interconnected with all these other issues, including the energy issue. You have the opportunity to grow energy crops if that land is being used to graze animals that are then being consumed in the UK. So we need to think about this as a system. So that's my final risk, is that we view this not as a system challenge, and this is, I think, the biggest of all the system challenges, genuinely whole economy, but we pick off individual little sectors instead and miss that opportunity to think about it in the grand sense. There's one thing I'll just highlight in this report that we're hugely proud of, which is that we've always been systems thinkers in the CCC, but this report takes that on to an amazing new degree. We are genuinely viewing the world, I think, as a set of system changes that need to be effected, and you can see that we're moving away a little from viewing the challenge sector by sector into looking at that that rainbow chart that Mike talked about of the overall challenge of cutting emissions across the economy. Those are big risks. If we don't grab that, if we don't tackle them early, then it's going to be hard to get to net zero.
Okay, well, we have approximately zero time left, but I think time to sneak in one final question about something that we haven't really covered yet. COP26, the UN Climate Summit, indeed in Glasgow, where Chris is right now, around this time next year. And there's a question here from Shaista Sheehan, who's saying the challenge that we're talking about here is, of course, global. So what will be our big ask of the world for COP26? That's a massive question. Baroness Brown, what
well,
would be?
I think we've by so rapidly accepting our advice on the UK NDC, which is entirely in line with the 6th carbon budget, I think we've put ourselves in a very good place to encourage others to follow suit. And while it's great to hear all of these commitments to net zero in 2050 and 2060, the path by which we get there is crucial because, of course, it's the accumulated CO2 emissions in the atmosphere that are changing the climate. So it is really critical not only that people get to net zero by 2050 or 2060, but that they have a really tough intermediate target. So these 2030 NDCs are absolutely crucial, and I'm really delighted that we have shown that we are prepared to do what is needed, and I think it puts us in a good position to encourage others and to help others if they need it to follow suit.
Okay, well, Chris, since you're in Glasgow, anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, just a little bit to add to that. I mean, I think the 2030 NDC is so important because it's a demonstration that it's about, you need to do a bit more than just set a mid-century net zero goal. You've got to do something in the short term too. I think the other thing that we can offer the world, and here I'm going to blow up my own trumpet a little, is that we have the framework in place to tackle this. So having us, of course, do this independent work, providing this technical analysis, having a Climate Change Act that sets out quite clearly a set of responsibilities for government to deliver on those emissions reductions is really important. And I think the last thing I'll say, and this I think is going to be a big theme for the COP next year, is that stepping back from just the government commitments, that's what the UN process is designed to deliver. There's a really optimistic story playing out around the world economy about the kind of transitions that we've been talking about today in transport, in industry, which we haven't mentioned so much, in agriculture, the challenge of heating and cooling, and of course the big energy challenge, moving away from fossil fuels from energy. Those are fundamentally international challenges, and they're being addressed by commerce. So what I'd like to see alongside all these national commitments and this kind of template for how you tackle them that the UK will be providing is more ambition and more excitement, I think, about the changes that are happening in commerce around the world. And I think in many ways you're going to see a more rapid progress in that commercial world. And I think if the COP can frame that up to go alongside the national commitments, then it can be a real moment next year.
Okay, well, sadly we are now out of time, and I'd just like to say thanks so much to the panel and also to the questioners. Some terrific questioners there. I did do my best to get through all of them, but thanks so much for that. And I'm now just going to hand over to Lord Deben to make some closing remarks. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Polita, and thank you again to the team which has put this whole 6th carbon budget together. There is now, for the first time, a very clear pathway to achieve what we have already agreed is our national statutory demand, net zero in 2050. But as Chris rightly said, we won't get there unless we really stuck into it now and can reach in 2030 the kind of levels elsewhere that we are now committed to with our 68% reduction in emissions. Nor will we get there unless we do it in the fairest way that is possible. Nor will we get there if the COP26 doesn't grapple with the issue of shipping and aircraft emissions, which are at the moment out with its figures, and they've got to come inside. But above all, we won't get there unless the government shows that it is determined in all ways and at all times to make this a national leadership with real support from regional and local government, and a determination to join with others throughout the world. This is the moment in which we can prove that Global Britain really works. And I believe that that is our destiny. We can give back to the world something extremely special. And this is the beginning of a great journey in which we, with others, will lead the world to battle its most serious material threat. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panel. Thank you above all to all those people who slaved for 2 years to produce this report. Now it's up to the government, to industry, to commerce, and to each one of us individually, to local government, regional government, and the nations that make up the United Kingdom, to ensure that what we've laid out today we achieve, and achieve immediately.